Thank you so much for coming, everyone, to the July Changing Planet seminar series. We're really delighted to welcome Janna Eklund from the University of Helsinki. Johanna did her PhD in the Metapopulation Research Group under Ilkka Hansky. She now works as a postdoctoral researcher in the Digital Geography Group at the Helsinki Institute for Sustainability Science. And we're lucky to have her here today because she's just finished a 3-month visiting research position at the University of Cambridge. Johanna is also the chair of the Impact Evaluation Working Group of the Society for Conservation Biology and hosts the Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual seminar series, which happens every month. And the talk today is going to be looking at achieving effective and equitable biodiversity outcomes using the protected area in Madagascar, and in particular the challenges that this has faced during the COVID pandemic. So if I just share my screen. And I will hand over to Johanna.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, for that very kind introduction. So can everybody hear me, both online and in the room? Yes, excellent. Yeah, and thanks so much for the invitation to come and speak in this Changing Planet seminar series. Really excited to be here. It's my first time actually at Silwood Park, so quite honored to be here celebrating also the 75th birthday of the campus as well. So let me start by thinking, so when I was invited, I started to think, okay, how does my own work relate to Changing Planet? So as Anna said, my background is in ecology and evolutionary biology, but nowadays, so I've been working quite a lot on land use changes, which I think links quite directly to the Changing Planet theme of the seminar series, but more and more nowadays actually looking more at the need for different policy changes in order to actually achieve the most we can with our conservation interventions. So that's what I'm here to present on today. And just very briefly, please do ask questions throughout the presentation. So I've been planning to speak for maybe 30 to maximum 40 minutes. But if you have questions, do interrupt me and ask, because it's much better that if there's some small question, well, you don't understand some of my graphs, I much rather explain it then, and then we can hopefully have a lot of time for discussion then towards the end. I'm really looking forward to hear, maybe building on your experiences of how that might have affected your work in different parts of the world during the pandemic. Well, this is just strange. We just tested it. Let's see now if we get the slides to move.
Screen.
Yes, thanks so much. Oh, could I still move the window so that I see my own text on the side, maybe? I'll just minimize it. Yes, perfect. Thanks so much. So yes, in my own work, I've been focusing on protected areas as a conservation intervention. So protected areas has been one of the main kind of policy tools in the toolbox of conservation for a little bit more than 100 years already. And we can see quite some steep increase from maybe 1960s, 1970s with the kind of awakening of the conservation movement at that time. I think in the beginning of the 20th century, many of the protected areas were perhaps more protected for iconic landscape values, such as Yellowstone National Park, for example, in the US. And then during the more recent decades, there's been quite some pushes by the international policy frameworks to actually increase the protected area network. So the previous targets set in Aichi, which aimed to have 17% of the terrestrial land under some type of protection by 2020. We've not quite achieved the target, but out of kind of like all the targets set under the Convention on Biological Diversity, I think most policymakers and scientists agreed that this is the targets we are actually the closest to maybe have reached. So I just checked the numbers, and currently we are a little bit under 16% in terms of terrestrial protected area coverage. And very briefly, what do I mean when I speak about protected areas? So this of course varies quite a lot. I think the majority of us might associate it mostly with perhaps national parks, which are there kind of both to protect biodiversity, but then also for recreational values. So protected areas can actually also not only protect biodiversity, but then provide different type of ecosystem services, such as, of course, obviously also climate change mitigation by binding carbon. And then, as said, different type of societal ecosystem services, such as recreation and well-being for human beings as well. But if we look then a little bit at how this achievement of the 17% target varies across the globe, you see quite some variation. So in dark green, we have the countries that currently have 17% their terrestrial land under some type of protection. And then in different shades of green, then the countries that are not quite there yet. And I think this map is quite interesting in light of the current ongoing negotiations for the next biodiversity targets. So in 2020, I don't know if you are familiar, but 2020 was supposed to be the super year for biodiversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity was supposed to have its 15th COP meeting in Kunming in China. But then obviously, boom, the pandemic hit us all in February, March. And then this meeting has now been postponed 4 to 5 times for 2 years. And I think eventually the rest of the world got a little bit tired. So now I think there was a compromise and this meeting will be held in Canada, but still officially the president will still be China. And this will take place this year's December. And there's quite some strong push towards increasing the target for protected area coverage. So something called 30 by 30. So many people thinking that we definitely, in order to kind of bend the curve of biodiversity loss, we would need to protect more, with then the ambition being to have 30% of both terrestrial but also marine land under different types of protection. And this is something going under the framework of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So I will kind of like keep this as the background of my talk and then relate back, hopefully wrap up my kind of results in light of these policy contexts. But I think policymakers are they really like numerical targets because it's something that is fairly easy to understand. It's fairly easy to then perhaps communicate to local politicians. And therefore, I think this, to me at least, is one of the reasons why this numerical target of 17% has been considered somewhat of kind of like a way forward. But my own concern ever since my PhD has been that, do we actually know how well protected areas work? So if for 100 years we've been putting so much effort into establishing new protected areas, can we really with certainty say that they actually mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss? And then most importantly, I think, hopefully it wouldn't come at a too high cost for the local communities. So still 10 years ago, it was quite common to evaluate protected area effectiveness in terms of just a simple inside-outside analysis. So if you imagine this turquoise area here, I've been trying to kind of provide this schematic, simple picture. So imagine that this area here is the protected area, and then we have some type of adjacent buffer. And it was quite common to just compare, for example, deforestation rates or declines in biodiversity from inside this area to the outside or adjacent land. But then there were studies showing that in the majority of countries on Earth, of course, protected areas are not randomly distributed in the landscape. Rather, in most cases, they are kind of located high and far. So far from urban settlements and usually at high altitudes or steep slopes, where of course the opportunity cost of other land uses are not as high. So it's very difficult to do, for example, agriculture, maybe at high altitudes or steep slopes. If you're too far from a market, it might be very difficult, or it comes at a high cost to transport, for example, then forest products. So what we ended up doing, or what people ended up doing with this simple inside-outside analysis, is that basically they were comparing something that is not really comparable, or at least it's not kind of representing the same level of pressures. So you are comparing a protected area, which even if it weren't protected, the hilltops are most likely not under the same type of pressure as areas that then are closer to urban centers or at higher altitudes. So then there came this big push, in part actually introduced by economists such as Paul Ferraro, for example, who tried to introduce this idea of counterfactual approaches, where the idea would be that rather than comparing inside-outside to some type of buffer area, we would try to find a matching area that would be comparable in terms of the environmental covariates. And I think this is very easy to understand if you think about, for example, medicine. I would assume that the majority of us would be very reluctant to take, for example, a pill for headache if we weren't certain that it had gone through a rigorous kind of randomized control experiment where we would have a treatment and a control group. And the problem, of course, in conservation, to some extent, but I think for spatial approaches to conservation and protected areas in particular, the problem is that it's rather difficult to set up protected areas as a kind of experimental setup. Because many, as I showed, of these protected areas might have been around already for close to a century. So we don't really know what the situation was before. And it's fairly difficult in some cases to actually be able to kind of like foresee the establishment of a new protected area and then set up a control group. But luckily, there are different types of statistical methods available, such as, for example, matching, which is what I have been using myself in my work, which basically kind of then matches based on a selection of covariates or confounders, so that we actually end up comparing like with like. So deforestation inside the protected area to then, for example, deforestation in a comparable counterfactual area. And then very briefly about Madagascar. Why Madagascar as a case study? So obviously, I think Madagascar is quite familiar to most people in conservation, at least, as one of the biodiversity hotspots. It has quite high levels of threat. So since 1950s, it has lost approximately 44% of its existing forest cover. And then, of course, with that, a lot of species have become highly threatened. So it's currently the country with the most listed threatened species out of all countries in the world. This, of course, has opened the eye for the international donor community. So Madagascar has also been one of the top 10 recipients of international development assistance earmarked for biodiversity, which, of course, has created this kind of playing field of different donor interests, international conservation versus more local approaches to conservation, and so on. Overall, at the moment, I think a little bit less than 10% of the terrestrial area is under some type of protection. Approximately, I think 1/3 of this is protected by Madagascar National Park, so a parastatal organization in charge of the kind of state-governed protected areas. And then in addition to that, there are more recent initiatives building more on co-governance and community involvement, but mostly run by different conservation NGOs, then in different levels of collaboration with local communities. But I think the key to understanding perhaps the complexity of conservation in Madagascar, obviously as in many places in the world, is the kind of socio-political economic setting. So Madagascar is still ranked as one of the poorest countries in the world, with a high fraction of the population actually facing severe food insecurity every year. Some of the years actually passing the threshold to be classified as a full-out famine. So I don't know if some of you might have heard that in 2020, 2021, at least the Times made big headlines by saying that the famine in Madagascar is the first one in modern history caused solely by climate change and not, for example, war or civil war or other type of armed conflicts. Of course, I think most of us working in Madagascar know that the reality might be a little bit more black and white. So even if Madagascar might not have been facing something as a civil war and like that level of conflict, the political situation is quite turbulent and they've experienced quite many political coups and political instability, which I think kind of irrespective of who's in charge, who's in power, it seems that especially the southern part of Madagascar seems to be seems to be facing a more or less chronic famine situation. It's really up to the year whether it trespasses the classification of being just severe food insecurity or full-on famine. Then obviously the pandemic, COVID pandemic made the situation even worse. But yeah, so that briefly on kind of like why Madagascar, it's challenging, but I think that is what makes it interesting as well. And I think I will move on to discuss my own results. So just showing this graph again, what we did was to take a counterfactual approach using matching to then compare like with like. And what we find, so we did one study where we looked at it at the network level, so not really separating between individual protected areas. But then the interesting thing that we wanted to investigate was whether there are differences between time periods. So on the y-axis here, we have the effect size that we were using, something called probability of success for dependent groups. It's not super important that you understand the details of it. I just want to say that any value more than 0.5 means that the protected area is effective. So it's actively avoiding deforestation, meaning that had it not been protected, you would have seen more deforestation. And as you can see, for all the three different forest types in Madagascar, so the humid forest in the east, and the dry deciduous forest in the west, and then the spiny, this very arid type of forest in the south, all of the protected area networks in these different biomes are actually successfully avoiding deforestation pressures. In the first time period between 1990 and 2000, you can see that the humid forest protected areas were the most efficient, whereas then in the second period, actually, then the spiny and the dry seem to be catching up. And then the opposite pattern for the spiny, where actually the effectiveness increased for the later time period than between 2000 and 2010. And this is most likely related to the fact that the pressures in the spiny and the dry were actually increasing during these times. So there were kind of more deforestation pressures in the counterfactual areas. And maybe as a side note, I could mention that towards the end of this 2000-2010 period, in 2009, there was a coup d'etat of the change of who was in power of the country. And it would be really nice to kind of continue this study to then see how that affected the consecutive years. But this is where our study period ended. And then because we saw variation between years or time periods, we were also interested to look at the individual protected areas. So did we see variation between the sites? And if so, could that help us to come up with some mechanistic solutions? So I think that the question of whether protected areas work or not is really interesting. And of course, that's something that we want to communicate to policymakers. But of course, ideally, I think at least for me, what motivates me is to try to figure out that what's kind of the mechanistical explanation, which are the type of management interventions that might be needing to be in place in order to actually see successful protected areas. So then we run using the similar type of matching methods, we run it for then the individual protected areas, not all of the protected areas in Madagascar, but the state governed ones. And what we found here is what you see in this map. So any value in blue shows protected areas that were actively avoiding deforestation. Then in yellow, we have a few, 5 of them showing no statistically significant effect. So we can't really say whether they were having an effect or establishing them was having had an effect or not. And then we have one problematic area Kalambatritra, which shows actually increased levels of deforestation inside the protected area. And this is quite interesting, something that a few other studies around the world have also found, usually an indication that some type of conflict is most likely ongoing. So for some reason, people are actively seeking to go inside the protected area to actually carry out deforestation there rather than in the counterfactual environment. But I think overall, the results for Madagascar are fairly positive. So if you consider the challenging setting, I think it's a success story for conservation. 29 out of the 35 protected areas are actively making a difference. So I think every reason to celebrate that and think about kind of exactly like what are the factors, what are the is there something generalizable that we could learn that could be then kind of lessons learned for other parts of the world as well? Was there a question online? No?
Is there some feedback? Just echoing.
And then,
No.
do I continue? Yeah. And then, because we saw this interesting variation between individual sites, we were interested to then see if there would be different types of management actions actually explaining it. So working together with Jonas Geldman and Lauren Codd, who have been compiling this really awesome data set on management effectiveness scorecards, we were able to get hold of the scorecards for then these protected areas in Madagascar. And these scorecards are something that actually usually, I think they were kind of developed in collaboration with WWF and the World Bank. And many of the big funders are using them as part of a reporting tool. It's a scorecard where the manager or a consultant is, I think there's around 30 to 32 questions related to whether the boundary is demarcated, whether they have enough staffing, what type of surveillance is in place, and so on. And rather than looking at the individual questions, we tried to group them based to kind of different dimensions of management. So we were looking first at design and planning, which relates to questions such as, for example, like, the placement of the protected area, whether the boundaries is actively demarcated out in the landscape, and so on. And then capacity and resources. So looking at the staffing level, their training levels, whether there's resources for kind of ongoing training, then monitoring and enforcement. So what type of surveillance, what type of monitoring are in place. And then finally, anything related to what we call decision-making arrangements. And this involves all type of like stakeholder engagement, whether it is with then other sectors of the state or the local communities. And I think we were all, of course, expecting to see that somehow there would be a correlation, so that, the better management inputs, the more protected area outcomes you would actually be seeing. But this doesn't statistically come out as significant in any particular way. Perhaps the only interesting thing is that Kalambatritra, the protected area that showed induced levels of deforestation, I think the good thing is that it clearly shows that managers are also aware that they are struggling, and that's also something that shows in these type of scorecards. But otherwise, not really something specific coming out of these type of analyses. And then talking to people in conferences, there's two other studies, I think both from Brazil or at least Amazonia, who have found similar patterns. So a complete lack of correlation between the management inputs and then protected area effectiveness in avoiding deforestation. And it's interesting to think, but I think one of the main critiques might be related to the type of data sets. So of course, there might be incentives for managers to actually report either that the situation is better than what it might be in order to keep getting funding from the big funders, or then alternatively perhaps say that it's very alarmingly bad in order to as well kind of like make sure that the continuation of funding. So it's a little bit kind of suspicion about how well these scorecards might actually be reflecting the truth. And therefore, we set out to actually approach the managers directly ourselves as researchers. So we arranged a workshop in the capital where we invited then a representative from all of the protected areas in Madagascar, and then actually had them brainstorm together, like what are their main challenges, what do they see as the opportunities for improving management, and what's the support that they would need in order to make their protected areas more effective. And the main challenges that they identified were quite strongly related to governance aspects, and perhaps not at the local site level, but rather at the national level. So I think the feeling I got from this workshop is that managers feel that they are put in a very, very challenging position. So you're there, you might be the head of a local site, but what do you do when you feel that there's no state support and there's kind of widespread non-application of the legislative frameworks for conservation in Madagascar? Then in addition to this role of the state and governance challenges, they did specifically lift up the problem of these ongoing fights against bushfires in Madagascar, which I might not have kind of talked quite enough about yet. So far I've been speaking mostly about deforestation tracked by then these land site imageries of land use change by 30 times 30 meter resolution. But this got me a little bit interested in like, okay, like fires clearly seems to be then the kind of one of the main drivers of land use change in Madagascar. So would there actually be data available specifically on fires rather than this coarser resolution land use change? And I think the reason for why fires are such a prominent threat for the protected areas in Madagascar relates to the type of kind of slash and burn or Sweden agricultural practices that are still widely adopted in the country. So people kind of use Sweden agriculture, burn the area for a while, then are able to kind of use it for agricultural purposes for a few years, but then have to move on because the soil become eradicated. And then of course, this leads to this kind of increasing patches of deforestation. And this is then something that you also see spreading inside or at least towards the protected area boundaries. But then the kind of fires are also used for other purposes. So sometimes they are not necessarily used to create land for agriculture, but perhaps to create kind of new foliage for cattle. And then sometimes kind of for outright signs of protest. So kind of putting the forests on fire has been already historically, when Madagascar was part of French rule, a kind of rather powerful symbol of opposition towards whoever then happens to be in power and setting the agenda at the moment. And then came the pandemic, as we all know, in 2020. And I was sitting in Finland. I had just been doing one of these stakeholder engagement workshops in January and returned. So there was kind of like fresh contacts in mind and an ongoing dialogue with the local managers in Madagascar and local NGOs. So then when the pandemic hit, I was sitting in my kids' room in Finland trying to think that, okay, what is it that I might be able to do remotely to then track this situation and how the pandemic might affect actually conservation interventions and how well protected areas function. And I think originally there were quite some headlines, and the majority of my collaborators in Madagascar were actually mostly concerned about this first hypothesis. So the kind of like how this reduced funding due to the loss of ecotourism or nature-based tourism revenues would affect the functioning of protected areas in Madagascar. So for example, the then General Director of Madagascar National Parks told me that approximately 30% of their annual budget comes from entrance fees, the majority of them then being international tourists. So they were of course really worried about how this absolute drop in funding levels might then affect like their management, but then also kind of secondarily, like the fact that tourists are not coming in might mean that they don't spend kind of money in the local communities. They might not go for a coffee. They might not contribute with other type of like small income to, for example, guides, nature guides and things like this, like recreational people providing recreational services around the protected areas. So that was kind of like the main concerns when the pandemic hit. And then of course, exactly like as I said, that then due to this, there was the kind of concern that there will be a reduction in the management effectiveness due to these budget cuts. And then obviously also just the direct effect of lockdowns. So during lockdowns, the protected area managers, especially in the beginning, were not allowed to travel. I heard some people saying that, for example, the cars that they were using usually for patrolling protected areas were then used for obviously information campaigns in local communities about the arriving pandemic and kind of health purposes. So a clear kind of worry that it would reduce the level of on-site management activities. And then of course, at the same time, as I mentioned, this risk that the local pressures might increase as the local communities living close to these protected areas might have created kind of and changed their local livelihoods to actually incorporate then different type of incomes from international tourism. So like to what extent they will be able to then shift that and possibly feel the need to supplement lost income by then potentially encroaching into the protected area networks. So these were kind of like the different hypothesized mechanisms that we were interested to explore. And very briefly about what we did. So originally we were thinking to do something a little bit similar as they do in epidemiology. So I'm sure you all remember when the pandemic hit, there started to be all this talk about excess mortality. So what amount of deaths, what number of deaths can we attribute to the pandemic? And then usually in epidemiology, they take the average of, let's say, the 5 or the 10 past years and then compare what we experienced in 2020 to this. So we started by doing something similar, then using remote sense data on specifically fires based on this VIRS satellite data provided by NASA, which is a really great resource because it's updated every 24 hours. So we were actually able to follow it kind of day by day in the beginning. But then working with Andrew Barnford in Cambridge and other really clever collaborators, they of course pointed out that maybe this is not quite comparable in an ecological process such as wildfires, because fires as a process are of course also affected by weather conditions. So if you have a drier year, it's more likely that you have fires kind of with or without the pandemic. And then because we knew that the famine was kind of like building up, there was a real need to control for this, and we needed to check whether actually the amounts of precipitation were also anomaly low this year in 2020. So what we actually do, rather than to compare the average during the previous years, was to compare to what would be predicted based on the precipitation levels of then this historical data. So what we did was that we used all the data going back in time since the satellite has been launched. And then we built zero inflated negative binomial models. And then using the following covariates, so the monthly precipitation, the precipitation in the previous month, and then the accumulated precipitation over the 12 previous months with interactions to the biomes of the 3 different forest types that I've been mentioning before. And then we compared the observed numbers in 2020 to what the model predicted. And this is then what we call, or what I will keep calling in this presentation, excess fires. So the observed fires minus the one predicted based on our model. And I think for you to understand the results, I just very briefly explain perhaps the seasonal patterns that we see in both precipitation, but also fires in Madagascar, because they are very much linked and most likely due to the Sweden agriculture practices in the land. So here again, we have different graphs for the kind of humid forest in the east, the dry forest in the west, and then the southern spiny forest. And if we start by looking at the precipitation, you see that the rain period usually starts from kind of October or November onwards, and then goes on for a few months until approximately March in the following year. And then the opposite pattern can be seen for fires. So you actually see a spike of fires usually right before the rainy period, because farmers are interested to prepare the land, so they do the burning and then they do setting the seeds so that everything is kind of ready for when they predict the rains to actually start. And I think we were, despite the fact that our model was fairly simple, I think we were quite surprised about how well it actually managed to capture kind of the 2 kind of opposing drivers of then fires. So I think fire modeling is still to some extent in its infancy, but what we definitely wanted to capture is this thing that if it's more dry in the more recent months, obviously you're more likely to see fires because it has been dry. But then the opposite is actually true if you look for the kind of like the past 12 months, because if you have then had more rainfall during the previous years, there's actually more biomass who might then dry up and then ignite. So I was quite happy to see that the the model captured this, and it captured it in a dynamic way, so that this accumulated rainfall started to then be a significant during the autumn months, so closer towards the fire season. And I think very briefly on kind of model performance, it did fairly okay. So it correctly predicted the number of fires for 63 out of the 95 months. So then for every month since February 2012 until then December 2020, with then poor model accuracy only actually indicated for one of these months, so August 2015, which you can keep in mind. But if we then start by looking at the excess fires inside protected areas previous to the pandemic, so just to kind of set the scene. So this is what we see before the pandemic. You see that the majority of them are kind of rather around the 0% change. We have the ribbon around the numbers is the 95% confidence intervals. So we do, as you can see, we do have a few instances where it actually shows. So like we see more observed fires than what we would predict based on the weather conditions. For example, in towards the end of 2013, and then here also towards the end of 2018. And then the bubbles that you see here are just the absolute number of fires. Just for you again to remind you that again the autumn is kind of the fire season in Madagascar. And I think again, having worked in Madagascar, I remember the day when these results came out in my art studio, and my mind was almost blown. Because during 2013 and 2018, there were actually national elections, so presidential elections. And I think that it's quite striking to see that some of these excess fires a little bit prior to these election campaigns seem to possibly also lead to an increase in encroachment into the protected areas. Then we have a few of these anomalies in 2016. Which might be related possibly to the El Niño phenomena, which was particularly strong in that year. But overall, I think kind of like we see a few anomalies, they are scattered around, but they are not usually kind of like many consecutive months ahead. So then the pandemic arrived, and I will not speak too much about all the details in this graph, but I think the things I would like you to remember is, so as we all remember, in January, the Chinese media first reported on the first death. And then on March 11th, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 global pandemic. And the president of Madagascar reacted quite quickly. So he closed all the borders from March 20 and enforced a strict lockdown for the whole country. And then, of course, at the same time, all the protected areas were closed, and many, if not all, of the management, kind of on-site management activities were at least temporarily put on hold. Then this was followed by a second lockdown in July for 2 of the regions. And then speaking to people involved in protected area management, it seems that from July onwards, the protected area management slowly started to resume, but they were not opened officially, for example, for external visitors until the beginning of September. And then that was only local Malagasy visitors, because all the way through 2020, international tourism was not yet allowed. So you couldn't actually fly to Madagascar except for very special kind of family or compelling reasons. And if we look at this corresponding time period, then in terms of excess fires, this is what we see. So almost up to more than a 200% increase in fires, compared to what we would predict based on the fact that the beginning of 2020 was a little bit drier than the average years. And it more or less exactly overlaps, this period of excess fires more or less exactly overlaps based on the previous graph with when the protected area management actions were on hold. Now, of course, I really want to stress that we can't really prove a causal relationship. And it's also quite difficult to know exactly what was going on in the different protected areas. So one of my co-authors is the coordinator of Forum LAFA, so one of the networks for terrestrial protected area managers. And they did say, report a lot about a lot of the challenges they were facing. But then some of them did also say that they were able, after a while, to increase actually collaboration with local communities. So to actually kind of like give more power to them who were in the right places on site to carry out some of the ongoing management activities. But the thing we know for certain at least is that all types of community engagement programs or training or education were put on hold in order not to risk spreading the disease. Then I think at some point, it seems after this paper was published, we were contacted by some people from the Madagascar national parks, and they did say that at least the Madagascar national park managers got special permits to actually travel even during the lockdowns. So that's kind of like hopeful news again, that the policymakers understood that these are quite essential service for society as well. But then, of course, I think like what I want to highlight is that there really seems to be an indication that this kind of break in ongoing management activities seems to be at least somewhat behind this. But of course, it might also very well be that it's mostly due to an increase in pressures driven by then people clearing land in anticipation perhaps of lost income opportunities due to the pandemic. And because of the study design we have, we weren't actually following the fire situation outside protected areas, so I cannot know to which extent the pressures on protected areas increased. And then just wrapping up here, looking a little bit at the geographical location. And I think here is where I really want to pause and make sure that nobody misunderstands the results. So we definitely don't want to point fingers at any particular protected area. And I think it's very important to stress that we looked at correlations here, so to see if there's any relationship with the IUCN category of the protected area, so how strictly it's protected, or the different management authorities, and nothing is statistically significant. But rather, if you look at this, it really seems that it's mostly 16 protected areas in the western parts of the country that were affected. And I think what we are providing as an explanation to this is that it's really not a failure of management at any level. It's really just kind of like because of the fire dynamics. So the forest or the different type of landscapes in the west are those that are most vulnerable to fire during the time of the year, which relates back to the previous graph when I showed that actually the burning in the western parts of the country in the dry forest actually starts earlier than in the spiny forest or in the humid forest. So what implications does this have for management, but then also for kind of wider policy? So I think definitely overall, I think my research shows that management is really crucial. Management matters. It's not enough to just establish a protected area. If we don't actually invest resources in making sure that there are active ongoing management kind of capable people on site able to do wise decisions, we risk ending up with so-called paper parks, so parks that are established on paper, but actually not really performing in terms of delivering biodiversity or climate mitigation outcomes. So I think it's really important to recognize that we need to keep on-site protected area managers or management going also in times of turmoil, and whether this is then a global pandemic or possibly other types of like abrupt social abruptions, such as for example, the national elections or other type of political instability. And then, as I mentioned, it seems that some management authorities did actually increase the level of collaboration with local communities, so handing over more of the power to them actually carrying out management activities. And of course, my hope is that this would be kind of leading to more sustainable practices in the future, and kind of move away from more top-down approaches to how protected area in some parts of the world might be run. And then linking this back to the post-2020 biodiversity framework, I think it's really important that we would get the message through to policymakers that yes, I'm all in favor of increased numerical targets for protected area coverage, but only on the condition that that means that we also get increased funding to make sure that there are actually kind of proper management in place. So protected area effectiveness is just as crucial as then protected area coverage, and I'm hoping that this will be reflected in the policy text. And then I think overarching, there is a big need for more and more studies evaluating different type of conservation interventions. So not only the area-based approaches such as protected areas that I've been speaking about, but all types of kind of conservation actions. We actually know surprisingly little about what works. So we know really a lot about all the changes that this planet is facing, but we know surprisingly little about the kind of changes in policies or activities in order to actually mitigate those declines. And that's why I just want to briefly end by marketing our impact evaluation working group. So if you find this interesting, then please do find out. There's the link. So we have an email list. We try to arrange meetings in association to the conferences arranged by the Society for Conservation Biology. And then we have just set up this new seminar series running the first Tuesday of every month. So Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual is the hashtag to look out for on Twitter. And I think we are currently on a summer break, but from September onwards, we will continue with Johan Oldekop giving a presentation. But that's where I want to end for today. I just want to thank my collaborators and then the funders and you for your attention. And then I'm really happy to hear any type of comments or questions that you might have.
Very much, Janna. That was incredible. Do we have any questions in the room to start with? Yes.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Okay, the first one is in terms of the protected areas, do their sort of ecosystems have to migrate forward because of climate change, and do you have to maybe readjust the boundaries of the protected areas to compensate for that? Yeah,
I think this is a really interesting, really interesting question. So I think for Madagascar, I haven't come across kind of initiatives for this because as you already saw, there's kind of a struggle to keep up with the current policy targets already as it is. But I think you're definitely right. And then especially seeing the increasing drought situation in the south, that's certain. I mean, seeing that it's so devastating that it leads to famines, certainly it must be affecting also all types of species and communities. So yeah, that I think is one of the big challenges ahead for sure as well. Yeah.
Just the second question.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile the climate impact of international tourists flying to Madagascar with the funding for conservation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you just repeat the question into the mic?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Yeah. So the second question is about how do we reconcile the kind of carbon emissions from having international tourism flying into Madagascar and then the fact that they are kind of needed to fund the protected area networks? Yes, this is an interesting question. Obviously, I'm totally open about the fact that I come from a Nordic welfare society where I think that we should not necessarily need to rely so heavily on market-based incentives for conservation as we are currently doing. And I see it personally quite worrisome that we are going increasingly in that direction. So I think definitely there will be a need to involve the private sector more and more, and I have nothing against that, but exactly as you say, that it might come with the most absurd and perverse type of incentives. So yeah, I think this is a challenge, and I think perhaps something that I hope that in these negotiations for new targets, at least what I've understood is that currently many of the countries in the global south are actually not very much on board of the 30 by 30 targets because they feel that they will be fooled and there will not be a commitment of funding by the global north. So I'm really hoping that the global north will understand their responsibility in this respect and actually commit with funding and not just exactly have 30% of the, I mean, if you think about the level of endemism in Madagascar, is it really the sole responsibility of Madagascar to protect it, and what's the responsibility of the global community? So yeah.
Are there any online questions? No,
Thanks so much for the talk. I have two questions. I'll ask the simpler one first. For 30 by 30,
Yep.
You showed earlier on in the results that generally the PAs in Madagascar seem to be effective in terms of reducing the rate of deforestation.
Yep.
So therefore, more PAs would seem to be a good thing. Do you think that, what's your personal opinion on 30 by 30 in terms of, do we need 30% in Madagascar, or should we focus on increasing the effectiveness of individual PAs, or is it actually just a matter of more PAs would be a good thing for Madagascar? Or
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think this is also a really, really interesting question. And then obviously myself being mostly familiar with Madagascar, but I think the question is very applicable to kind of a lot of countries in the global south. And I think perhaps the first response that come to my mind is that yes, I'm all in favor of increasing area targets, but only if we don't risk creating increased conflict with local communities, which might actually undermine the effectiveness of them. So I think there will be a very fine balance. And then I'm worried that a numerical target such ambitious as 30% might just risk pushing it too much if it actually leads to local communities then feeling kind of betrayed by the international community, and then perhaps in a way kind of going back to this kind of old power inequality between who decides what type of conservation is being done. So I'm all in favor of it if it could be done in a kind of equitable way, so that it actually benefits also the local people of Madagascar and their big need for development, because still there are kids starving to death in southern Madagascar. So yeah, perhaps still not an expansion of the protected area network at that expense.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. The second part of my question was actually about biodiversity offsetting.
Yeah.
Mining concessions in Madagascar. I know that there's been some work on avoided loss offsets, which have proved to be relatively effective.
Yes.
In decreasing the amount of deforestation when coupled with mining projects in Madagascar. What are your personal thoughts on avoided loss offsetting? Because for myself personally, and I'm asking for transparency, I suppose they lack, from my perspective, they lack additionality in the sense that they may be able to sort of flatten the curve, but they're never going to bend the curve upwards.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion?
What's my opinion on that? Yeah, so exactly, like I haven't been involved in that type of work, but I guess you're referring to this paper where Julia, so one of my co-authors, was actually, so they were evaluating the effects of I think it was the Rio Tinto mine in Madagascar, and the results were kind of cautiously positive in that sense. So there could be kind of room or scope for actually seeing some benefits by then mining, which of course, on the other hand, would provide poor Madagascar with a source of income, and then perhaps hopefully getting on the kind of wagon of development, so that then the pressures on primary forest wouldn't be as high. So I feel very divided, and I think it's one of those questions where I haven't even made up my own mind in terms of how I even feel about it. But I think it's really, really cool that there's more and more of these robust evaluations of these type of approaches. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more of that type of work, like of all types of approaches to conservation, and then maybe a few years ahead we will be able to say something more. But I think you're definitely right that no matter how robust the impact evaluation studies, it might not always be able to capture all type in terms of offsetting problems. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Dr. And my question was about so it seemed like you chose deforestation as the main kind of like proxy for effectiveness. I was wondering, like, the why of the choice, and why didn't you look at, for example, how the populations of wildlife were doing?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, and something that I probably should have actually stressed during my presentation. So what we are seeing, exactly as you say, is that using very crude measures of land use change, it seems that they are doing a fairly okay job. But there's always the risk of this leading to the empty forest syndrome. And I think especially in light of Madagascar currently having the highest number of threatened species, I think there's a high risk in Madagascar that what we are seeing is declines in a lot of the species also inside protected areas. And I mean, personally, it's just because the problem of that kind of species or population level data not always being available for these kind of counterfactual studies. So the problem is that we do have fairly good data, I think, all over the world in terms of population trends inside protected areas, but it's definitely much more scantily collected outside protected areas. And then when doing this counterfactual matching, we might not actually have biodiversity or population data for a comparable area. So therefore, it's very difficult to kind of get that type of effect size measure. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and something that I should stress all the time when I speak about this, that actually there's rather few studies. But I think also Hannah Wolchamp together with Julia just had a paper, I think was it Nature, where they looked at water birds and protected areas. So they actually managed to get hold of a really cool data set where they were able to actually do matching studies on then population data of water birds.
Protected areas sometimes are actually favoured for deforestation. Protected areas where there is civil unrest. What are the drivers behind this? Do you know? Is it a safety thing? Is it a protest thing?
Yeah, I think it's a combination about both. So after we found those results, I was then in touch with the local protected area manager agency. And then, because I had been actually originally interested to possibly do a field visit to that site, but they definitely warned me against it because apparently the security situation is so poor around that area. So what they in Madagascar usually refer to as bandits. So these cattle bandits that kind of like go around raiding villages and then so I think, yeah, it's something that they are definitely well aware of. And what I understood based on the people sitting at the headquarters in then Antananarivo, they said that even they have to then contact the gendarmes, so the kind of rural police force, to actually help them with the patrolling. So they don't even have on-site presence all the time because it's too dangerous in that region. So yeah, definitely kind of exactly unrest. And then based on our analysis, very difficult to know whether then kind of this is related to kind of the movements of kind of bandits from outside, or whether it might be then actually local populations who out of desperation actually kind of might take cover inside the protected area even.
People are seeking personal protection within it.
I don't know. It's just I don't know. It's just a speculation. But yeah, the only thing I know based on speaking to managers is that it's apparently like a very turbulent area where there are severe security concerns, including for the managers.
Rather a basic question.
Yeah.
What is a protected area? Is there an international definition, or just countries make it up for themselves and you survey the best?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I decided not to start by kind of that. So yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay, exactly. Yes, and I think like the reason that I didn't want to kind of go into that swamp is because exactly as you say, I guess it started by just different countries setting aside land based on their own national legislation. And then there's been different attempts to standardize it. So I think currently IUCN is trying to kind of mainstream this categorization that they have, ranging then from management category 1 and 2, which are quite strictly protected, then to, for example, 5, which allows even some type of sustainable use of the natural resources inside the protected areas. And then it's up to every country based on their own national legislation to kind of cross-check their protected areas and their protected area networks with these categorizations suggested then by IUCN.
Could you give us an example of what's a protected area in the UK? What sort of place?
Yeah, and I think kind of having been here for 3 months, I think this is, I think the UK seems to be quite interesting because obviously you also have, so in Madagascar, usually the majority of the protected areas are either national parks, so very much also kind of protected for recreational purposes, or then something that they call special reserves, which fall under this category 5, so allowing actually some type of sustainable use, not as strictly protected as national parks. But then being here in the UK, I've understood that the national parks here allow, for example, apparently like even people living, building roads, and apparently even, you know, yeah, quite a lot of development inside the protected areas. So I think, and I think this is a really good question because it goes back to the international kind of policy agendas, that if you look at this this graph where I had in the beginning kind of which are the countries that have currently actually achieved the 17%, you saw obviously there's the majority of European countries being there represented. And now, of course, it's mostly them who are driving the agenda of increasing it to 30%. I even had a look at how many of the European Union countries that are currently at 30% on paper. So obviously for many of the countries in Europe, a target increase to 30% won't really come with any real cost for their countries. And it's just an agenda that kind of like in a way they are just, you know, forcing again this power dynamic on the global south to then live up to some standards. And then we are in a way expecting them to protect these endemic marvelous species and pointing the finger if they are having failing protected areas, when exactly as you say, Natura 2000, I would be really interesting to see kind of how the protected area networks of Europe are actually performing in terms of biodiversity protection.
Yes, I mean, I was
Yeah.
looking at the map. I mean, one country is 17% and another
Yeah.
country is 3%.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is the problem with the numerical targets, that it's kind of like they are easy, but they risk making us lazy in a way. Yeah.
So I guess it leads on slightly from this question, but I guess if the goal of the PAs is to increase biodiversity, I guess to kind of keep the nature as it is, for example, are there alternatives to that in terms of kind of rather than having specific areas, looking at more kind of not global, but relatively more global area, and trying to kind of manage that from a larger scale? Is it PA, I guess, an easier way of rather than managing a whole piece of land?
Yeah.
You manage a specific area to try and get similar targets in the end goal.
Yeah.
Are there some balances there?
Yeah, I'm sure. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. I'm not super familiar myself, but there's this whole debate in conservation between land sharing and land sparing, which is very much touching on exactly that. So is it actually for biodiversity, but then also, of course, for other kind of sectors in society, would an approach of land sparing, such as, for example, protected areas, so setting aside kind of areas specifically then for biodiversity or climate change mitigation, and then doing the development or urbanization in different areas. So my feeling is that there start to be more and more research building up in the fact that perhaps this land sparing might in many occasions be more kind of like for the same level of investment, we might actually achieve more in terms of protection with that approach. But then, of course, land sharing might sometimes be much better in terms of equity. And then considering, because I think like my worry with protected areas is also that like if it leads to, for example, like this big eviction of full villages or something like that, which again, obviously, for example, in the UK have not been done. So yeah, I just perhaps want to highlight that I'm not an expert on that specific, but there's quite a lot of really interesting studies on land sharing, land sparing.
I guess a lot of that will come back to, again, the conclusions for this talk is that actually has to be managed. Kind of paper PA is one thing.
Yeah.
Kind of land sharing area is one thing, but it has to be managed well.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Questions online? Okay. Well, thank you again. Another round of applause for you, Anna. We're going to be heading down to the marquee now for drinks and a barbecue. So if there are any more questions in the room, then please come along. I'm sure Janna will be happy to talk to people over a cup of drinks. But yeah, thank you very much for coming. Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah. No, I'm excited about it.